Let's look at the quarterback battle, of course. Drew Pine, Tyler Buchner. I'm going to liken the use of those two quarterbacks in backing up Jack Cohn to what J.J. McCarthy experienced at Michigan. They didn't shy away from giving them time against meaningful, especially Tyler Buchner, against meaningful opponents, good opponents in some key situations. But of course, maybe the play calling was limited. Your thoughts about the quarterback battle?
It's going to be interesting. I mean, you've got two very different players. We've been asked, do you think Notre Dame will play two quarterbacks? And I say the only way they play two quarterbacks is if Drew Pine wins the job, because then you'll see Tyler Buchner be used like he was last year because he's a very dynamic athlete. But, you know, everything that we've heard from sources is that right now they think the expectation is that Tyler Buchner is kind of the leader in the clubhouse right now because he's a very dynamic athlete. But the thing that we didn't get a chance to see much of last year is the fact that Tyler's a better passer than people realize. A lot of fans kind of look at Tyler and say, well, and he was used this way, that way, or the other way. And the reason Notre Dame played him the way they did last season is because they had a guy that could drop back and throw the ball. That was Jack Cohn. What they needed from Tyler was this is a dynamic guy that can run the ball. And, you know, we looking at from Notre Dame's standpoint, we don't have the ability to just go out there and run the ball and run, the run blocking for most of the season last year was not good. But when you go look at the run game numbers when Tyler Buchner came in the game, they were much better, because teams had to respect him as a runner. As you see down there, you know, 7.3 yards per carry, and just was a threat. And you'll see Kyron Williams' numbers were better when he was in the game. Logan Diggs had did some damage when he was in the game. And now it's about evolving as a passer, and that's the next step for Tyler Buchner. And I think some people forget that this is a kid that threw for over 4,400 yards and 58 touchdowns as a junior in high school. And so he's a kid that has the ability to be effective as a passer, but he's going to have to become a more consistent player. He's kind of altered his throwing motion. He's going to have to kind of still harness that and be consistent with that, because when he made some throws last year, as you see in the stats below, he made 35 throws. And as we saw, like in the Virginia Tech game, we saw the best of Tyler Buchner and the worst of Tyler Buchner, which is, you know, he threw some beautiful balls in that game. A go route, you know, early to Kevin Austin, where he just dropped on a dime, hit Avery Davis on a backside seam route. And then he throws the ball right into the chest of a squatted cornerback who picks it off and runs it back for a touchdown. Those are the things that Tyler's going to have to get better at, right? It's just his grasp of the defense, being able to go out there and process and throw on time and show anticipation and then be able to get the ball out accurately. Drew Pine, on the other hand, you know, doesn't have the athleticism that Tyler Buchner brings to the table. He doesn't have the size. Maybe he doesn't have a big arm and all those type of things. But what Drew can do is run the offense. And we saw that when he came off the bench against Wisconsin last year when Jack Cohn got hurt. Wisconsin went down and scored, went up 13-10. Notre Dame returns the ensuing kickoff back for a touchdown. And Drew really just kind of took over from there, threw a touchdown pass to Kevin Austin and really helped put that game away. You know, came into the game against Cincinnati and they were down, I think it was like 17-0 at the time, and, you know, led them to a couple scores and threw a touchdown pass to Braden Lindsey. So he's just that kind of kid, Mark, where you look at him and you're like, he's not real big, doesn't have a great arm. He's an okay athlete, but not a guy that's going to scare you. There's nothing about him that you really fall in love with except the fact he just makes plays, you know, and I've called him he's the ultimate point guard quarterback, that if you put talent around him, you know, he can run the offense. And, you know, he's not a Magic Johnson type of point guard. That's Tyler Buchner. He is more of a John Stockton type of point guard, where he may not, at the end of the day, you're like, yeah, he did okay. And then you're like, oh, he went 22 of 30, you know, for 298 yards and 3 touchdowns and, you know, ran for 12 yards and moved the chains and, you know, just had a really effective day. And that's what Drew brings to the table. And I think his presence and what he does is a lot of what Tyler Buchner needs to do. And so I think that presence really challenges Tyler, and they kind of push each other, but also do it in a healthy way where if you talk to any source I have, they're really close. They get along well, and they push each other in an encouraging way, as opposed to the kind of quarterback battle that has separated the locker room at times at Notre Dame in the past, especially when you go back to the 2016 season.
Running back Kyron Williams moving on to the NFL, gained just over 1,000 yards, 14 touchdowns out of the backfield last year. Is Chris Tyree going to be like 1A and basically he's the guy, or how do you see the distribution working?
I think we're going to see a 3-headed monster this year. We're certainly going to see Chris Tyree and Logan Diggs, but I'm not going to be surprised if Audric Estime is not part of this equation at some point in time as well. And the thing, I think the thing that Notre Dame coaches love about it is they all bring very different skill sets to the table. And when you look at a guy like Chris Tyree, I mean, he's a home run hitter, Mark. I mean, he's the kind of young man that it doesn't matter where you are. We saw this against Syracuse in 2020. We saw it against Florida State. We saw it last year, actually, in the pass game. He had 250-plus-yard touchdowns in the pass game last year. Run game really never got going for Notre Dame. But he's just, I mean, he was a kid that 2 years in a row in high school was the fastest player in the country, or fastest track person in the country in the 55-meter indoor, not just for football players, but anybody. He twice won the fastest man competition at the opening when he was coming up as a prospect. So he's a home run hitter. So he's going to play. But I don't know if Chris is the kind of guy you're going to use, like, Georgia used Nick Chubb as part of that two-headed monster back in 2017 with Sonny Michel. He's a guy that you're going to say, hey, look, we got to get him 10 to 15 touches a game and get him in space, and he can run the ball, the inside zones he can be effective on. He can be effective on the off tackle, but he's sort of if I compare him to a back, he's the kind of guy that would have thrived under the old Mike Shanahan offense, where it's like one cut and go. He's not going to juke a bunch of people. He's not like a Reggie Bush type of athlete. He is a patient, plant and go. And then you see that crease and it's gone. Logan Diggs, on the other hand, is a lot bigger. He's 6 foot. He's about 200 pounds, but he's really shifty. He's kind of got that elusiveness, that make you miss ability, which is kind of interesting. You'd think it'd be Chris Tyree that would be that guy, but Logan Diggs is that guy. And at times last year, he got a little bit too cute with the ball, but you almost kind of understand it with how bad the offensive line was. They were so used to kind of having to make people miss in the backfield that they just, even when they weren't getting penetration, they were kind of reacting like they were. But he brings an element where he can put his shoulder down, but he can also make people miss. He can make plays out of the pass game. And then Audric Estime is also a rising sophomore. I mean, he's 6 foot, 230 pounds. I mean, he's just a big, ripped, chiseled kid. And if you go back and watch him as a senior in high school, when he averaged about 10 yards a carry in New Jersey, when he won the Gatorade Player of the Year there, and then when you watch him just the one game he got carries this year against Navy, I believe it was Navy, he's got great feet for a big kid, which, of course, that what guy is going to that remind Notre Dame fans of? 230 plus, great feet, right? Okay, so you automatically get the Jerome Bettis, comparisons, but he's a guy that's going to push to be a part of that rotation too, and he brings some of the hammer to the table, but he's not just a hammer. And I think Dylan McCullough's got to think like, who blessed me? That I get to not only go to Notre Dame, but I'm walking into this situation. And there's a lot of talent there. But, of course, at the end of the day, it won't matter if the offensive line doesn't get better.
Yeah, and that's a peculiar statement that if 2021 passed some college football fans by in regards to what Notre Dame was able to do week to week, and they weren't looking at the units specifically, that Notre Dame struggled along the offensive front. So what are the prospects for an improvement in 22?
Well, look, even if there wasn't a new coach, the line would be better just because there's so many guys coming back. They're going to have 8 kids back next year that have started at least 2 games in their career. Obviously, Jarrett Patterson comes back as one of the best centers in college football. Josh Lugg came back for his 6th year. You've got Steve Carell. Andrew Kristofic started 7 games last year. Tosh Baker started multiple games. Michael Carmody started multiple games. But it's really the return of Patterson at center and the sort of the presence of the 2 rising sophomore offensive tackles from Blake Fisher at right tackle and Joe Alt at left tackle, and they're sort of interchangeable there, that sort of provided hope, at the end of the year, like, hey, these kids are really good. Joe Alt's dad played at the University of Iowa, played in the NFL for a while. Was a kid that I thought was going to need more time to develop, and he was ready a lot faster than we thought. We all knew that there was going to be a freshman All-American offensive lineman in Notre Dame last year. I mean, everybody knew it. We just all thought it was going to be Blake Fisher. But then he got hurt in the first half of the Florida State game, didn't return to the bowl game, and he played very, very well in the game and a half he was there. But you've got those 2 young bookends at tight end. You've got Jarrett Patterson up the middle with the 2 tackles coming, returning, or the 2 young tackles. That also allows Josh Lugg, who started all year last year until the bowl game, a right tackle, to move inside the guard where we think he's going to be where we think he's more comfortable. He's just one of those guys, Mark, where he's never been super comfortable as a space guy. He's a big, strong kid. He's 6'7". He's over 300 pounds. He's around 310 pounds. He's just a kid that you want to be in tighter quarters. Well, as a guard, he can do that. And his game, I think, is better suited for that. And then, of course, Andrew Kristofic, who got 7 much-needed starts last year. So there's a lot of optimism about the line. And then, like I said, there's 3 guys on the bench that have started at least 2 games each. And then there's younger guys like Rocco Spindler, and Notre Dame just signed, one of the 5 to 6 best offensive line classes in the country this past year. So the expectations that they're going to improve no matter what. But then when you combine that talent the young talent with the return of Harry Hiestand, that's where you start to kind of get excited about it. And, Harry Hiestand during his last tenure only got to work with Matt Balis, the strength coach, for 1 year. And in that 1 year, they ran for about 270 yards per game. And it was kind of fascinating because they had a lot of injuries at running back that year. And it's like it didn't matter who they put in at running back. Josh Adams had a monster year, had 1,400 yards. Dexter Williams only had 30-some carries, but averaged like over 9 yards a carry. Tony Jones did well when he got in. Deion McIntosh even did well when he got in. Brandon Wimbush had over 800 yards rushing as a quarterback. And they really couldn't throw the ball that well, but it didn't matter because that line was just so good. And so there's a lot of excitement about, now you get another chance to see Matt Balis and Harry Hiestand together with a young but very talented offensive line. And you start to kind of get excited about, boy, they have some opportunities to do something there. And then if Tyler Buckner wins the starting quarterback job, that's where you start to see like, hey, this team's got a chance to really be effective running the football. And, and we haven't even got into the weapons on the perimeter, which could ultimately be the best part of the offense this season.
We are fortunate to have Bryan Driskell here to talk Notre Dame football. You can catch him on Irish Breakdown, of course. Get on over there for your Notre Dame football coverage. Hit the like button, folks. Help us out. Hit the like button. It's a big deal here on YouTube, and subscribe here at the Voice of College Football. All right, let's get to the wide receivers and the weapons on the outside. Kevin Austin put up almost 1,000 yards at like 19 yards per clip last year. He's off to the NFL draft, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
So Lorenzo Styles, Braden Lindsey, and some others. So what's that rotation potentially look like?
Well, we keep getting asked like who's the alpha going to be at receiver, and I'm like Michael Mayer, right? Like that's going to be their dude, right? And so at receiver, it's just about how can you fit in as part of like sort of complementary players. And we did a show yesterday about the wide receiver tight end unit on our channel, and the thing that we said is this could end up being the strength of the offense. The problem is because of a lack of numbers and some uncertainty, and the guys got to really prove themselves. The margin for error is like really narrow, and that's the thing is you could go from this is a great group to one guy gets hurt and another guy maybe doesn't pan out, and all of a sudden you're struggling with the weapons on the perimeter. And so there's a lot of potential there, but a lot they've got to prove. Braden Lindsey's shown that he can be a home run threat. He scored on the screens, he scored on reverses, he scored on jet sweeps, he scored on post routes. He's done a little bit of everything. He just has struggled to stay healthy the last couple of years. That's been an issue for him. And to be honest with you, Mark, he wasn't coached very well. And that was something that you've heard me complain about for the last couple of years, that this is a receiving core that just doesn't know how to play the game. And you even look at Kevin Austin, he's a kid that had, 888 yards and 19 yards a clip, but then he disappears against Purdue. He disappears against Cincinnati. He disappears against USC. And any other team that had any kind of big physical corners, they just come up and press him, and he didn't know what to do. And yet he still was able to have the success that he had. And it just was a really fundamentally unsound group. Now you get Braden Lindsey back for a fifth year. Lorenzo Styles is going to be a sophomore, and he finished his year on just a great note with 8 catches for 136 yards and a touchdown against Oklahoma State. And what's interesting is that's kind of where a lot of the excitement comes from with this group, because you have Mayer coming back. You saw Chris Tyree had over 100 yards receiving in that game. You look at what Lorenzo Styles did, had sort of his coming out party last year. And you've got Deion Colsey, who's emerging in that position group. Joe Wilkins is back as a fifth year. Avery Davis is coming back as a 6th year. He got hurt last year. And, last time we really saw him making plays, he's shown he can be a big play guy. We saw what he did, to Clemson in a clutch moment back in 2020. He had a big 60-yard touchdown catch against Purdue to kind of break that game open, and he's just a really solid all-around player. He's a captain. So the talent's there, and then in the fall, they're going to get Tobias Merriweather, who, I graded out as the best receiver recruit, my highest-graded receiver recruit for Notre Dame since probably going back to Michael Floyd back in 2008, which is, saying something. So there's a lot of weapons there, Mark, but all these guys we're talking about, it's if this guy can do this, and if this guy can do that, and if Braden Lindsey can improve his technique, and if he can stay healthy, and if Lorenzo Styles can take the next step, and if Deion Colsey can break out, and if Avery Davis is healthy, you don't ever really want to go into a season where you've got that many ifs. And I think that's where sort of the excitement has to be sort of, tempered a little bit and say, hey, look, yes, there's a lot of talent potential, but there's still a lot this group has to prove. But I think the way that they ended the season, you look at Oklahoma State, for example, in the 13 games before they played Notre Dame, they allowed one player to have 100 yards all season. Notre Dame had 3. And that doesn't include the 7 catches for 76 yards and 2 touchdowns Michael Mayer had. And all but one of those guys is coming back. And I think that's where a lot of the excitement comes from, is we finally got to see Tommy Rees open things up in the second half of the year after Brian Kelly basically checked out, and just Tommy Rees was able to do kind of whatever he wanted to do. And you put in a running threat at quarterback, either Tyler Buchner, who will be a direct running threat, or Drew Pine, who's just a more mobile kind of view him as like maybe a more mobile version of Jack Cohn. You start to say, boy, with the weapons they have coming back, they could be really good. And again, we haven't even talked about the fact that they may have the best tight end in college football. I mean, Brock Bowers, and there's a couple other guys are going to have a little something to say about that. But, Michael Mayer is certainly going to be in that conversation. And there's whoever the quarterback is, there's going to be a lot of talented weapons. And assuming the receivers can kind of take that next step, that's where a lot of the excitement comes from. Because in the past, Mark, we've seen like years where they had, great receivers, but maybe injuries at running back and injuries at quarterback, like we saw in 2015. And then there's a year in 2017 where they've got the best line in college football. They got dynamic running backs, and then they just not great at receiver and a quarterback that can't really throw. This is the offense that, at least on paper, right? That's where we're at right now, is on paper, has a chance to kind of have really dynamic players at all of those spots. And that's why I wrote the article I wrote this weekend that said, look, people have used speed as an excuse for Notre Dame for years. That's not going to be an excuse for Notre Dame this year when it comes to their offense. Now, they got other things they got to worry about, but speed is I mean, when a guy like Lorenzo Styles is maybe your third or fourth fastest guy on offense, you've got plenty of speed. It's just about, can that speed turn into football production? That's going to be the question mark.
So, Brian, you brought up arguably the best tight end in college football, Michael Mayer. Question number one is, because there is no question here about his ability and what it looks like at the tight end position, how does he compare to some of the great Notre Dame tight ends, number one? And number two, is there going to be a complementary guy that's going to be significant in that offense as a second tight end?
It's a good question. In regards to the first part, I can only talk about tight ends in my lifetime. Like, I never saw Ken McAfee play. I never saw Dave Casper play at Notre Dame. I never saw the only time I ever saw Mark Bavaro play, he was in a Giants uniform, right? Like, I can't compare him to those guys. And then you look at the greats of the Lou Holtz era, the Derek Browns, the Irv Smiths, they never really produced. I mean, we pointed this out on our show, like, Irv Smith is considered this great player. He never caught more than 20 passes in a season, right? I mean, Derek Brown never caught more than 30 passes. They produced all these high draft picks at tight end, but none of them ever actually put up numbers, because of the type of offense they played. And, so then you kind of look at the great production Tyler Eifert had, and they've had Kyle Rudolph. I mean, they've had a ton of great tight ends, but I mean, Michael Mayer, if he can just kind of be what he was last year, even if he doesn't improve, I think he goes down to the best tight end of my lifetime, right? And again, that's all I can compare it to, because production's tremendous. He already has well over 1,000 career yards after just 2 seasons. He had, set a Notre Dame record last year for catches in the season with 71. I think he had 840 yards, which also was a Notre Dame tight end record. He had 7 receiving touchdowns, which is a Notre Dame tight end record. And when you can shatter all those Notre Dame, records for a tight end in one season, and you're a true sophomore, you're pretty good. And the thing about that kind of excites me as an observer of Notre Dame and a lot of Notre Dame fans, is he was a true sophomore last year. And there's parts of his game you say, hey, look, he's a good route runner for his age, but there's areas where his route running can continue to improve. There's areas where his run blocking has to improve. And then even more so, it's like, okay, now that he's a junior, his volume from absorbing the offense is going to be even greater, which means maybe you can change his usage. So maybe they play him out wide a little bit more, like they did Tyler Eifert back in 2011 and 2012. Maybe they can use him, detached from the line of scrimmage more. Maybe there's some certain things where, you could go with an alignment of Lorenzo Styles, Avery Davis, and Braden Lindsey, and you say, there's not a true boundary guy in that group. Lorenzo Styles is the biggest guy, like 6'1", 186, 187. Maybe there's not a true boundary receiver. Well, yeah, there is. It's number 87. He's 6'5", he's 250, and he runs pretty fast. You put him in the boundary, and then you put your 3 really fast guys to the field, with Chris Tyree in the game, and it's like, okay, pick your poison. Do you want to put numbers over here to help you with all the speed, which means you got to go one-on-one backside, or are you going to double team Michael Mayer back there, and then you're going to have at least one-on-one either with one of the receivers, and then you're going to have to deal with the running back and Chris Tyree. So there's a lot of potential matchup issues there with Michael Mayer because you can move him all over. And now that he's a junior and he's got some time under his belt, you feel more comfortable being able to handle those things. Because look, Mark, you can move him wherever you want. You can put him at boundary, slot, outside, attached, wing. But you have to have a package that's effective out of all those things, right? Like there's got to be things you do out of those things that impact and scare the defense. And I think that's where you hope that you'll see that from Notre Dame this year is where, teams are going to look. What's Ohio State's game plan going to be next year? It's simple. 87 is not going to beat us because they don't have anybody else on offense that's proven to be that guy, right? Because Kevin Austin is gone and Kyron Williams is gone. It's like, hey, 87 is not going to beat us. So the best way you can help Ohio State accomplish that goal is just kind of leave him in two positions, right? Well, the way you make it difficult for Ohio State to stop him is to say, hey, you're not going to ever know where he's going to be. And then he's going to do different things out of it. And then you see how Ohio State defends that or whoever, Ohio State, Cal, Marshall, North Carolina, whoever. And then you say, okay, here's their Michael Mayer game plan. Now here's how we're going to use our other weapons to complement that. And, what we don't know is if one of those other weapons is going to be a number 2 tight end. And obviously 12 personnel, 2 tight end, 13 personnel, 3 tight end. That's been a big part of Notre Dame's offense in recent years. And that's a little bit of a question mark right now. You've got Kevin Bauman's the elder statesman of the rest of the group because George Tack has transferred to Boston College, which is a great pickup for BC, by the way. And he gets to kind of, play with Phil Dracovic again, who they came into Notre Dame together, if you remember, back as part of the 2018 class. And so you got Kevin Bauman, who was a classmate of Michael Mayer. He was a 4-star recruit that gets overlooked a lot. And he's been injured a lot. And then you've got Mitchell Evans, who's a guy that Notre Dame staff is very high on. He's 6'7", he's 240. He was a quarterback as a senior in high school. He's got some ability, but he's got a long way to go from a developmental standpoint. Kane Barong's a guy that there were some folks in Notre Dame are very excited about, but he tore his ACL late in the year in practice. You've got Eli Raridan and Holden Stace coming in as true freshmen that are really talented. Eli Raridan tore his ACL playing basketball in December for his high school basketball team because he's a really good basketball player. So there's a lot of talent there, but a lot of question marks. And so right now, I don't know who the second tight end is going to be. And I'll say this, if one of those 2 tight ends, Mitchell Evans or Kevin Bauman, don't separate sort of during the spring, they're going to have a hard time holding on to a job come the fall when Kane Barong comes back and when Holden Stace and Eli Raridan show up. Because right now, I don't know who that guy is going to be. None of those guys are necessarily great blockers right now, and that's really the primary objective for the number 2 tight end. So that's going to be one of the few position battles that is really open right now because, Mark, you watch Notre Dame, the number 2 tight end is kind of like a starter as much as they play 12 personnel. You're playing starter snaps in a lot of instances. So who that guy is going to be is going to be one of the more interesting battles, and somebody has to win the job. It can't just be a thing where, of the 2 guys that didn't play well, you're the best. Because Notre Dame doesn't have to play that guy. They can go 11 personnel, they can go 20 personnel, put a second running back on the field. There's a lot of different things they can do. They don't have to go 12 personnel. So if they're going to play a lot of 12 personnel, that second tight end is going to have to earn that spot. And that's right now a big question mark right now as we're kind of 4 practices into the spring.
Talking Notre Dame football, Brian Driskell's here to do the work. Catch him on Irish Breakdown, of course, whether you like Notre Dame or not. If you love college football, it's a must. So get on over to Irish Breakdown and check out Brian's content right there. Before we possibly move on to the defense, as you mentioned before we started to record, recruiting's in a lull for just about everybody right now. Brian Kelly has certainly upped the ante and left a full cupboard for Marcus Freeman and staff 7th-rated recruiting class in 2022 that of course, Marcus Freeman was able to maintain. But looking at what's upcoming, everybody wants to know about Dante Moore. Carnell Tate listed Notre Dame in his top 5, which is loaded with blue bloods. What's on the horizon?
Well, real quick, Marcus Freeman had a big role in that number 7 ranked recruiting class. It was driven by the defense, and he put that class together. But I have to get that little dig at Brian
Absolutely.
Kelly. I just can't help myself. But look, it's closing time for Notre Dame, right? And there's a lot of players like a Dante Moore, like Carnell Tate. Braylon James, who's a top 100 receiver from Texas, visited Notre Dame this past week as well. They had 5-star athlete Samuel Mpemba on campus this past weekend. They had Jaden Osbury, which I love this. Baton Rouge native Jaden Osbury was on campus for his second visit this past week. Notre Dame did a great job with him. You know, and a couple of those guys are like Braylon James is I think he's a 4.2 student, and was looking at Stanford and Notre Dame. Happens to also be really talented football player. Jaden Alsbury is a very good student, which is why he's now made 2 trips to Notre Dame on his own dime, talking about coming back for the blue gold game. So Notre Dame's in a great position with all those guys. Jason Moore from Maryland, they're in a great position with, from DeMatha. You know, Christian Gray is a kid that it's a Notre Dame, LSU, Ohio State battle. There's a lot of players on the board, but for Notre Dame, it's like, okay, this is all great, but you got to close now, right? And I think it all starts at quarterback. I think that's going to be the key, is closing on Dante Moore. You know, obviously Michigan's trying to get him, Michigan State, Miami, Texas A&M recently offered. He's visited Florida recently. I mean, he's been to LSU. He's been all over the country. Notre Dame's got to close, right? And they've been in great shape with him for a long time. Dante's another one of those, you know, those kids that supposedly didn't exist, you know, during the Brian Kelly tenure, these top 50 5-star kids that also are great students. He's a 4.0 student. And, you know, so it's about everything about Dante screams Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's got to make sure that they can convince Dante of that as well. And I think they've done a good job so far. It's just closing time, right? And that's going to be the key. And, you know, they're hoping to get him on campus by the end of March. He's kind of gone all over the country, and Notre Dame is supposed to be kind of like his last stop. And Notre Dame's going to, you know, try to get that push, because I think he'll announce a decision by the end of April. I think that's kind of what I'm hearing, is the game plan is going to be no later than the end of April. So you're getting into that crunch time, and if you get Dante Moore, then that gives you a much better shot at getting Cardinal Tate. You know, all of a sudden now Charles Jagasaw and Monroe Freeling, who are 2 of the best offensive linemen in the country that Notre Dame is looking at, they're trying to get Monroe Freeling out of South Carolina, right? Like, it's going to be a lot easier to do that if you have a 5-star quarterback in the class. You know, you're trying to get Rodney Gallagher out of Pennsylvania, who's a dynamic player that Notre Dame loves. It's a lot easier to do that when you've got a 5-star quarterback, right? And so I think that's going to be the key, is Dante Moore is that domino that makes everything else kind of fall in place. They're going to have a top 10 class this year. There's no question, unless they just lose half the class they have right now. But is it going to be 7 to 9 to 10 like it's kind of been for years? Or can you finally sort of tear down that wall and say, you know, we're going to have that number 1 or number 2 class? That's going to be, in my opinion, determined by their ability to close out on Dante Moore. If they can do that, I think the dominoes start to fall. If they don't, then it'll be a typical Notre Dame class that's pretty good, but not to the level of Bama, Georgia, Ohio State, and programs like that.